Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Lake on Fire by Rosellen Brown. Read by Emily Lawrence. I carry a brick on my shoulder in order that the world may know what my house was like. Bertolt Brecht. We must admit there will be music, despite everything. Jack Gilbert. 1. For all the years of her life, this was the story Chaya told. The missing parts stayed missing. There were many brothers and sisters Jodorowsky, but Chaya loved Asher best, 1,000 times best. He was her only vanity. She was the oldest sister. Between them, there were 6. Yaakov, Beryl, Binyamin, Yitzhak, Dvorah, and Masha. And, in 2 different graveyards, the large one there, in Zhytomyr, and the fresh one here, in Christo, Wisconsin. A few more, souls shaken out of them like seeds from a burst pod, early or late. The only one lost in the new land was Sorle, who, as a baby, just learning to walk, caught a fever that almost killed the rest of them. She was one of the helpless pioneers of the stone-hard graveyard, out in the fenced place, as far from the barn and the house as they could take her. The first act a community of Jews must perform, even before they build a place to pray, is to make a burial ground and fence it away from unhallowed soil. They understand the priorities of the universe too well to be frivolous. The children's mother was brusque to them all, so busy they remembered her mainly as motion. Sewing, darning, cooking, planting, sweeping, all the ing words. Her hands flashing faster than barn swallows. There wasn't much left of her for loving, although they knew that the motion was somehow meant for them. Chaya was the one who, back in the grim city where they were born, caught Asher's first word. 2 words, actually, spoken clearly at 6 months, while their mother dozed over his nursing. "It's Gilded," or so her mother heard it. "Gilded?" she gasped back at him, rudely awakened. Her nipple, abandoned, quivered like a lip before tears. "Shine!" Finished. Chaya tried to console her mother. She had been a smoother, a reassurer, a peace-bringer from the first day she discovered discord. It was a treasure and a fault, this desperation she felt to rush ahead of anyone headed for a painful confrontation, to cushion the blow about to land, whether out of kindness or out of her own need to be loved, in gratitude. "Mother," she whispered, looking regretfully at the basket into which her baby brother had been thrust to quell his thirst alone. "Mother, sweet," which she was not. "Little mama." But she saw the way the affront misted her mother's eyes. Who was this Asher, stranger than any of her other children? He was the most curious child who ever lived, Chaya understood, and he became, early, a little mill for grinding words into questions, a memorizer, a challenger, a declarer. It was not her mother's imagination that he seemed to have been born talking. He was never still and never silent. "Get away!" she would shout at him. "Go away," and swat at him as if he were a horsefly. Silent herself, Chaya was glad to give him her ear. She loved them both. So, in a single gesture, Asher had been weaned, and in spite of Chaya's placating murmur, his mother never forgave him. He seemed to have slipped between this year's pages of Who Shall Live and Who Shall Die as a special case, larger than mere life, exempt from all that burdened the rest of them into ordinariness. Asher was not relatively astonishing. He was an absolute. Still, condemned to crawl on a cold Russian floor in the lee of the drafts that came in under their door. His genius was not, except to his sister, cause for celebration. And now they lived in a place called Krista in the state of Wisconsin. A joke, such a name for a pack of disheveled Jews, some of whom swayed and prayed, others of whom blasphemed. The pathetic piece of land they lived on, 17 of them, before the addition of any new life, or the subtraction of old, had been assigned by the powers of the Hebrew Emigrant Assistance Society. With the best of intentions and a dangerous optimism, the association's clerks moved pins randomly on their map as the hordes poured by the thousands out of the pale, ahead of or behind the pogroms, the empty stomachs, the laws and the threats and the curses. Undoubtedly, they looked at their maps with satisfaction. They were not making exiles. They were making Americans. Chaya was 14, newly arrived at the age of self-consciousness when they left Zhytomyr. She would forever remember their arrival with feelings of exhilaration turned to shame. How Asher came leaping down the narrow stairs of the SS Stettin into the crypt called steerage, slipping on the damp floor, clinging to the walls, shouting, "They're here! They're coming in! Everybody on deck! Schnell! Schnell!" Her brother was now 8, small, lithe, with slanted gray eyes that looked for action wherever he could find it, movement, sparking energy, and danger if there was any to be found. One of those boys fueled by risk. He had a map of ringworm on his scalp that had eaten his spiky hair away in a spiral. His eyes, when he yelled at his family to hurry, were as round as the portholes no one in steerage had so much as glimpsed. He blinked them rapidly, signals of his earnestness, and was gone. And so they hurried. They washed themselves off as best they could without much water, mothers showing the way to children, and straightened their stringy hair that they had sweated in for weeks, adjusted their clothes. Chaya's thick dress smelled vaguely of vomit, and, worse, not even hers. And as if it were Shabbos, and they were rising into its light and sweetness, trusting, they rushed up the many narrow sets of stairs, single file, to crowd against the rail. The air was so thick with fog it beaded up on the steel sides of the ship, making the rivets shine. Their mother had one fist over her heart, the way she did on Yom Kippur, when she beat her breast for her sins. "Oh, Lord, let it not be London," she muttered, to herself. She could never alarm her children on purpose. She had heard of cases where a family bought a ticket to New York and found itself dumped with frightening finality on the dock in Liverpool or London, duped by the agent, and out of luck. In America, Father had said, and said again, in public and alone, they encourage Jews to be people of substance, not only the people of the book, which doesn't feed their children. Here we will take care of ourselves, eating from our own crops, owing nothing, working with our animals. Though no one had animals in Zhytomyr, no one had crops, It was not even a shtetl, with a concave cow and yards full of geese. Ruling ourselves without fear of pogrom or famine. We will support ourselves cleanly and healthily, not in the city and not in the village, which everyone knows is a foul sty, a blight of dependent paupers.
Fievel,
she had heard him say.
Every town has a fievel like ours, or a velvel, or a yossel, who sits on a box at the corner of our street. The most decrepit of beggars, a walking swarm of flies, an animated rag pile. Is that what we want the world to see when they see a Jew?
Chaya would listen, a little moonily, respecting and slightly fearing the avid swell in his voice.
Now imagine Fievel sitting on a bench beneath an apple tree, watching his sheep graze.
She knew Fievel. He was lazy. He was inept. He might even be a little bit mad. But that was not the point here. It was the saving balm of the barnyard her father wanted them to think about, when the mysteries of the farm still seemed simple to unmystify and master. He himself was a bookbinder, adept at intricate finger movements, which, though the work kept his hands busy, left his mind and his mouth free for endless political debate. In another world, he could have been a senator, possibly a journalist. In his world, he was only a dreamer, which meant that his wife worked harder than he did to keep his family in herring and stale heels of bread.
And when we arrive, the Americans will meet us with a band,
the dreamer assured them.
This I have heard.
Ah, he could be persuasive. She ought to have asked where he had heard it, but even had she doubted, she would not have dared.
Trumpets and a drum?
One of them asked, smiling, and he said yes, really.
And with flowers. They will give us tools, and the animals we will need to start our new life, and bring us in a wagon, and show us to our own spot of clean dirt.
His father, their grandfather, had farmed a piece of a peasant's land illegally, and had been stripped of his goods, beaten in the farmyard by the Tsar's inspectors, and laughed down the road and out of sight, long before their father was born. To be a farmer, legally. But the children had to wonder what he meant by clean dirt, the planting dirt he promised. Their mother and Chaya and the other girls had enough trouble keeping the house straight, swept, swabbed. There was no such thing as dirt that was not an affliction. But their father tended to be right most of the time. A wise family did not separate its hopes from its fathers. Up on the deck, Zanvil the Hatter had the flag. He had kept it standing up out of the muck. He wore a smile so wide, his stubbled cheeks crushed up under his eyes, while he struggled to pull the flag loose from its carefully tied binding of rags. Then, with a flourish, he shook it out, and it sent a sharp report, like the crack of a gun. It was a moment they had dreamed of. There it was, still crisp and clean, never yet used in the real world that preceded this dream. Olam, carefully embroidered in gold upon a red field. Below that, all 10 commandments, the sewn letters tiny as ants, and a plow standing by itself, waiting to be seized, its 2 handles wide as the horns of a barnyard bull. Across the bottom, the words, proud and square, in a Yiddish with grand serifs. Arise from the dust, throw off the contempt of the nations, for the time has come. Zanvil, having protected the flag from Zhytomyr to Hamburg, to their ship, was the one they chose to hold it up. They raised their fists and cheered and shouted and made a happy racket. This unspeakable journey almost done. The children jumped so that they could come down hard and noisily on the damp deck. Zanvil was wagging the banner in the fumy air, gold on red, a rag of color against a cloud, and all of them were cheering, when a man in a dark blue uniform and a hat — he looked rather like a trolley man, but did not carry himself like one — poked through the rows with a face like a hard fist made for bruising. What, he demanded none too nicely, were they doing? No, what did they think they were doing, as if they just might be misinformed? Between them, as it happened, there was no more than a thimbleful of English, but because Zanvil had already been in America before, in Baltimore, and returned in a fury, full of himself, when his wife threatened to divorce him if he stayed away a minute longer, so they heard when their mother spoke in her gossip voice. He was able to say something about celebration and, perhaps badly put, the land. The land, he said. Something about taking over the land. Am Olam means people of the earth. It must have seemed that he dragged his words under the man's nose like cat scent to a dog. He meant 10 acres, a fence, a barn. The official repeated Zanvil's last words with astonishment. Take over the land? By the descending movement of his hands, they could see that he was ordering Zanvil to lower the flag. Couldn't they? Couldn't they? No, Zanvil said. He was a squat man, amiable, hairy as a hound. Now, though, he looked like a small guard dog, ineptly preventing passage. Or else, the man threatened. This is a free country. That is why we are here. Zanvil flung at him. Something like that, although not comprehensibly. The crowd tried to make taunting noises in their own language, or halfway in it, in something they took for the sound of democracy, in which they knew they were free to say anything they pleased. The trolleyman's face deepened a few shades, and a cord beat in his forehead as if it were counting off time. Under a wide mustache, he bit his lip, considering. Then, like a school child, with an awful sound, he lunged at Zanvil, whose cap flew off over the rail as if it were a shot bird, and floated for a while, till it picked up the weight of the water. Then it sank. They tussled for a moment or two. The rest of the men cried out in anguish and leaned in to try to help, but they were afraid to be too bold. The women simply shrieked, and the trolleyman managed to seize the broomstick that was the pole of the flag, bang it angrily against the shiny rail to try to break it in half, then, in frustration, raise it over his head, whole, and fling it, as hard as he could, into the white wake of the ship. It came down slowly, and spread itself out for just an instant, like a tablecloth. A fancy Shabbos cloth, against the dirty greenish spume. A rise from the, and one horn of the plow, and then, whipped into a frenzy of bubbles and shreds, it was dragged under the body of the ship, and down. He smoothed his mustache with both his forefingers, restoring his dignity as if he were soothing it. There, there. Then he nodded curtly at the rest of them, and disappeared behind a curtain of fog. So much for the flowers and the plows. Chaya was afraid to look at her father. Blame and its suppression would come later. Now she wanted so devoutly to go home that she'd have been grateful, would have borne another 2 weeks of stink and turmoil gladly, if the ship were to turn and make for Hamburg, to return them to Europe, all of them safe. The vibration that had thrummed under her feet as steadily as a heartbeat had broken off for good, and she was overcome with panic laced with disappointment, and, another layer beneath that, a roiling anger for which she had no words. 2. Was there a biblical curse that promised 5 years of squalor, spoilage, and rot? They called themselves the Fields of Zion, and, for all their hope, they came naked to their future. Native-born farmers from Massachusetts, from New York and Vermont, flowing westward on a river of restlessness and ambition, faced every cruelty of nature, but not innocence. At least, they were familiar with the soil, with animals. They knew how to build. But the Fields of Zion farmers were gray-faced and weak-fingered from too many years in a murderous city. Their lungs were coated with factory smoke, their minds fixed either on a book full of holy exhortations, O Lord our God, be gracious unto thy people Israel, and accept their prayer. Remember us this day for our good, and be mindful of us for a life of blessing. Oh, may our eyes witness thy return to Zion. Or, on the socialist mission to undermine all that and blame forces equally abstract for every evil. None had ever stood behind a plow or seen hail flatten a greening field. Their first bewildering night, fresh from Castle Garden and an endless train ride, they had slept in a field in one large circle, feet toward the center, like the spokes of a wheel. They managed to find a sawmill, and, with no English, bought wood, more costly than they had expected, and built the fewest buildings possible. Given the cost of pine, the Commons, one large building, was going to have to suffice for a very long time. Each family had a single, porous-walled room. The wood that had been loosely assembled was so green it still bled sap. In time, great rivulets ran down its surface like those marvelous paintings of the Madonna that weep miraculous tears. It rejected nails, actually gobbled them into ragged holes that meant that no one could hang any ornament or picture without quickly discovering it in a tangle on the tilting floor. Then, not counting 2 outbuildings, one for men and one for women, so that modesty could remain at least technically unbreached, came a barn, leaky and canted, and finally a chicken coop that the chickens avoided when they could, never confiding the source of their dissatisfaction. Chaya was repelled by the spectacle of her respected elders reduced to gawking children, inept and unprepared. She could not forget the trolley man cursing at the little crowd as they huddled on the fog-bound deck. What must he have been saying in that language she knew not more than 3 words of? Hello and thank you, assiduously practiced in her bunk. Go home? We don't need your kind here? Whatever it was he shouted when he ruined the flag, at that moment, were they cursed? How else could the end have been written at the very beginning? She was a girl from a gray and stony city. When she studied the Field of Zion's buildings thrown up quickly, crookedly, by the light of their faith that such approximate carpentry would hold, and then the chicken coop when their birds spent too much time hiding. Still, she was glad they had not been turned back to Hamburg. Unpainted, gray as the sky, the building seemed to be riding an ocean of green. When the wind blew, and it did, viciously without barrier, the long grasses danced like surf, swaying, bowing, miraculously recovering, just to be leveled again. She was bewitched by a beauty she had never seen, The fat spread of raindrops on the doorstep, the sweet smell, better than warming dough, that rose from the damp ground. There was such a promise of peace here, and safety. Empty space without a shadow on it. She had never really seen the horizon before. Perhaps she could be happy here. But there was work to be done, and bills to pay from the little they'd been given. A small packet alongside their train tickets. The building sometimes swayed in the wind. When the cold poked through the walls, over the sills, it whistled, a thin sound like an unattended kettle. Slowly, slowly, the ship began to list and take on water. Chaya began to feel it, one worry at a time. The hens were either very dumb or very smart. They left their eggs, some but not all, in the low bushes outside their coop. Either the coop was all wrong, built badly somehow, its sills already splintering, and they preferred to nest in the dead leaves on the ground, or they were being clever and having a good morning laugh. But when she came with her basket looking for the eggs, it wasn't funny. Hollering at them didn't help. Not only do they not tend to be clever, but one did not reason with chickens. The cows were bad milkers. There were two, called ein and zwei, 1 and 2, because in a muddle of tradition, someone had insisted that giving them human names would insult the memory of a departed soul who had happened to share that name.
Do you say Kaddish for a cow?
Zanvil it was. Zanvil the Hatter. The cow pond, coated with scum like fat on soup, only this soup could not be skimmed. There was no clean water for a mikveh, which tormented those who cared. The women monthly, the men before holidays and holy events. You were supposed to immerse yourself completely, over your head, your hair slicked. But if you did that in the cow pond, you came up cobwebbed with green silt and mucus weed, reeking like foul breath. No honor to God or self in that. The dry rows of growing greens, stunted, crooked, choked. Nothing burgeoned, nothing spread, little flowered. Tomatoes hung riddled with wormholes, hard and pale pink. Lettuce bolted before it could thrive. Onions went dead in the ground, their green flags browning from heat and lack of rain. Rusted tools, bought used, cheap, but a bad bargain. The wheels of the blue wagon did not match. Every trip, sitting in the remnants of hay, clots of manure on her boots, she rattled so badly she came unstrung and quivered like an old woman the rest of the day. The horse, poor ratchety horse, reorganized the flies with a frayed tail and watched her smooth her dress and try for dignity after a ride like that. And then there were the others. Yenim. Some Chaya loved. Toiba with her kind face. Uri, the jokester. Others were either too pious. Pessia and Zanvil, Mordechai, who had no wife, Lazer, and Itzach, who fasted Mondays and sometimes Thursdays and, famished, could not work. Or simply Meshuggah, too crazy for this world. Mutal spoke to no one. Bunya was a secret drinker, but not so secret that he didn't tip over tables, fall asleep in the snow to be found by the bony old dog, weep, loom, cower. Why did nothing thrive in this place? Whom could she ask? She could not ask her mother and father, because they had chosen this, or at least chosen the idea of it. She seethed at the casual way in which the men from HEAS, upstairs at Castle Garden, pink-skinned, clean-scrubbed Germans, who handled them with their fingertips like dirty laundry, had sent them forth, no questions asked, with no support but that small wallet of cash and no instruction.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?